Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to explore an element of miniature work that keeps showing up, whether we plan for it or not. It's something that's fascinated me since I first started working in miniatures, and that's windows. There's a particular image I find myself returning to again and again. You're walking or driving past a house in the early evening. The sky has already gone dark, but inside there's light. Not enough to see anything clearly, just enough to suggest that someone might be there. A lamp in a corner, a kitchen light left on. The impression of warmth without any real proof of it. You don't stop, you don't stare, you might not even consciously think about it, but the image stays with you. And if you build miniatures, especially in closed scenes, dioramas, or book nooks, you've probably noticed that windows can sometimes show up in your work more often than you originally intended. They're not always historically correct, they can add complexity to the build, and they can appear at the last minute during the build. But once they're there, the piece suddenly feels more settled, even if it's hard to explain why. That's what I want to explore today. Not so much windows as symbols, and not windows as architectural features per se, but windows as a recurring solution in miniature work. Something many of us return to because it's an element that resolves problems that are very specific to working at small scale. Over the years, I've noticed that windows tend to do a few kinds of work for us, whether we're conscious of it or not. They help us compress space without having to build everything we're implying. They help place the viewer in relation to the scene, so it reads quickly and comfortably, and they give us a surprising amount of control over light and enclosure, which turns out to be central to what we experience as warmth at small scale. When I say enclosure, I'm talking about how held a space feels to look at, whether it feels contained or exposed. That first issue is compression, which is one of the most persistent challenges in miniature work. One of the frustrations I've had with working in miniature is that the world doesn't shrink evenly. We tend to assume that if we scale everything down proportionally, the relationships will hold. But perception doesn't really cooperate with that assumption all the time. Detail shrinks well, texture shrinks well, but perceptually, space collapses very quickly. At full scale, a room can feel expansive and open, regardless of the number of objects that are in it. If the same room were reduced to a miniature scale, it can feel cramped and confusing or strangely flat. There's too much world in too little space, and the viewer has to perceive it almost instantly. If you've ever created an interior that felt technically correct, but felt somewhat uncomfortable to look at, this could be what's happening. There are too many cues competing for attention and not enough hierarchy. In a real room, we understand space gradually as we move through it. In a miniature, we take it in immediately. A real room is something you experience through physical movement, but a miniature room must be understood perceptually, as the viewer cannot physically occupy it in the same way. This is a key distinction in scale perception literature. That means miniature artists have to edit reality far more aggressively than full-scale environments ever require. And editing space is much harder than editing objects. It's relatively easy to decide whether a chair belongs in a scene or not. It's much harder to decide how much room the room itself should contain. This is where windows become incredibly useful. A window lets you imply space without constructing it. Instead of building a second room or a long hallway or an exterior scene that competes with the interior, a window suggests to the viewer that the space continues without asking them to follow it. In general, implication is often a more effective tool than completion for communicating ideas at small scale. This idea of implication shows up in a lot of research, from visual cognition to environmental psychology to narrative theory, all of which look at how we make sense of incomplete worlds. When you attempt to portray everything, the scene can actually appear smaller, not larger, due to the fact that the eye does not know where to focus, and perception can struggle with too much detail in a compressed space. A window provides selective absence. The viewer is provided with sufficient information to recognize that there is more beyond the boundaries of the window, without needing to resolve it. This is also why windows often end up working better than doors in certain scenes at miniature scale, not universally, but perceptually. A door implies physical passage and movement. It raises a question the scene may not be able to answer. Where does this lead? A window allows the viewer to engage without raising those types of demands. A window encourages looking, interpretation, and narrative inference without requiring the world to continue beyond the scope of the piece. Windows also allow you to create depth without having to pay for it. The interior is the foreground, the window frame is the middle ground, and the area behind the window is the background. Whether the area behind the window is merely darkness or a suggested light source, it will be interpreted as distant. You're not duplicating the world, you're convincing the eye. Once a miniature scene becomes easier to read spatially, something subtle but important starts to happen. The viewer stops trying to decipher the space and starts experiencing it. Their attention can shift away from figuring out what's going on and towards noticing how it feels to look. That shift has a lot to do with where the viewer understands themselves to be in relation to the scene. One of the realities about miniature work is that the viewer is never neutral. They always arrive with a position, whether we account for it consciously or not. They're standing above the piece, leaning slightly forward, maybe tilting their head, maybe stepping closer and then pulling back again. Although the scene itself remains stationary, the act of observation is actually physical. This is something I didn't really consciously think about early on, but it's become clearer to me the longer I've been creating dioramas. At full scale, architecture does a lot of this work for us. Rooms tell us where to stand. Doorways suggest movement. Hallways imply direction. At miniature scale, none of that exists unless we build it into the scene. Windows are one of the most effective ways we do that because they establish a boundary the viewer understands intuitively. You don't have to think about it. Your body perceives it before your mind does, which aligns closely with how embodied perception actually works. Windows help establish where the viewer stands in relation to the scene and the world beyond it. It sounds simple, but establishing that relationship has a big impact on how comfortable a miniature feels to look at. When the viewer is uncertain of their location in relation to the scene, they're more likely to hover awkwardly. They'll lean in too close and then step back. They won't be certain of where to direct their eyes or how accessible the scene is. A well-crafted piece can appear unsettled if the viewer is unsure of their relationship to the scene and how they're supposed to view it. When a window is included, that ambiguity can vanish. Not always, but it can do a lot to help the scene. The viewer will immediately comprehend that they are not permitted to physically enter the space. They're meant to look into it. That distinction changes the entire tone of the interaction. Looking in is quieter than entering. Observing requires less of the viewer. They're not navigating the space. Observing permits the viewer to remain in the same position and simply observe. This is especially noticeable in private viewing, when no one is watching how long you linger or where your attention goes. You can stand quietly in front of a piece and let your eye drift without any sense that you're supposed to get something or move on. But it's also noticeable at shows in the moments when you're not evaluating or comparing, but simply pausing. You walk past dozens of pieces, and most of them register quickly: competence, skill, subject matter, and then you keep moving. But every once in a while, something slows you down. Many times it's a scene with some sort of window, whether it's a literal window or a viewing window. Not because it's dramatic or flashy, but because it tells you how close to get. You lean in just enough to look through the opening. You stop just short of the boundary. You're held there in that in-between distance longer than you expected. Windows are particularly effective at creating that pause because they formalize the act of looking. They turn it into a deliberate stance rather than an accident. You're not circling the piece, scanning it for information. You're standing in one place looking. That's one of the reasons windows feel so natural in enclosed formats like box dioramas and book nooks. Here I'm using window a bit more broadly to mean both a window inside a scene and the opening we're invited to look through from the outside. Those formats already limit movement and viewpoint. You can't circle them. You can't change your angle very much. You're offered a single vantage point and you're asked to accept it. A window inside that frame reinforces the relationship. It tells you how close is close enough and where to stop. Instead of feeling restrictive, that limit often feels clarifying. You're not meant to inhabit this space, you're meant to witness it. That hovering just outside the world, close enough to see, far enough to remain separate, is something miniature work does exceptionally well. Windows make that stance explicit instead of accidental. They also prevent the scene from becoming demanding. An open wall or cutaway can feel instructional, as though the scene is explaining itself to you, which is not bad, but it's sometimes you want a different experience for your viewer. A window feels discovered. It gives you access, but only on its own terms. And because that access is limited, you tend to look more carefully. You notice light falling across a surface. You notice how much of the space is withheld. You start paying attention to what isn't shown as much as what is. When a scene with a window feels tranquil, even when the subject matter itself isn't tranquil or calm, this is often why. Enclosure and orientation do more emotional work than we realize. That boundary is doing work. It's telling you where you belong in relation to the piece. And once that's settled, your attention can relax. You're no longer trying to place yourself, you're simply looking. That subtle clarity around viewer position is one of the reasons windows are so effective in miniature work. And it leads directly into another effect that's harder to name or explain, but just as powerful. The way windows shape how we read light and enclosure, and why so many scenes with windows feel warm, even when they aren't meant to be. When we talk about warmth in miniature work, we usually mean something emotional, cozy, inviting, familiar. But at miniature scale, warmth isn't physical. There's no temperature, no air movement, no actual comfort to step into. Whatever warmth we experience is constructed entirely through visual means. And windows give us an unusual amount of control over that construction. At full scale, light is often something we react to after the fact. It comes in through windows, reflects off surfaces, shifts throughout the day. At miniature scale, light is something we decide. Even when we aren't consciously thinking of it in that way, we're choosing where light is allowed to go, where it stops, and how much contrast the scene can tolerate. A window creates a boundary that light can interact with. Instead of flooding the entire space, brightness can pool. It can be confined. Confined light often reads as warmth, which lines up with what we know about how vision and contrast work. This is especially noticeable in winter scenes and night scenes. Even when everything outside the window is cold or dark or implied to be inhospitable, the interior doesn't feel harsher because of it. Often it feels more protected. The contrast between inside and out creates enclosure, and enclosure is one of the main ingredients in visual warmth. Darkness gives light a location to reside. At the bench, this often shows up late in the process. You might have a scene that's fully built, fully detailed, technically finished, and yet it still feels uncomfortable. The instinct is often to add something, another object, another surface detail, another small point of interest. But what can often actually resolve the scene is a decision about light. Sometimes it's narrowing a window opening. Sometimes it's reducing the number of light sources. Sometimes it's deciding not to light the window at all and letting it remain dark and silent. A dark window surrounded by solid walls still does a lot of work. It defines interior space. It reinforces enclosure. It limits exposure. In some scenes, an unlit window creates a deeper sense of calm than a lit one ever could. Warmth doesn't always come from brightness. Sometimes it comes from restraint, perceptually as much as emotionally. At small scale, uncontrolled light can undo a scene very quickly. When everything is equally bright, nothing feels intentional. When everything is equally dark, nothing feels legible. Windows can help you regulate that balance. They allow light to behave in a way that feels deliberate rather than accidental. This is true whether you're using LEDs or simply painting the suggestion of light. The window becomes a regulator, a place where brightness is allowed to exist without overwhelming the space around it. And once light is under control, another shift happens almost automatically. The scene stops asking for explanation, which is where narrative enters, often without us realizing it. One of the aspects I've always found most compelling about miniature work is how often it tells stories without showing anyone at all. No figures, no action, no explicit moment frozen in time. Just spaces that feel inhabited or paused or recently used. Amazingly enough, figures can sometimes be limiting at miniature scale. They establish location, they direct attention, and often fix the narrative in place. That can be incredibly powerful, but it can also limit the possibilities. A window tends to do the opposite. A window suggests that someone could be there, or was there earlier, or might return later. It holds time open. It implies continuation without specifying direction. A chair near a window, a desk with light falling across it, a partially drawn curtain. None of these elements are doing anything, but together they imply rhythm, habit, presence without a body. What's interesting is how strongly viewers respond to these traces. You don't need to tell them a story. You don't need to explain who lived here or what just happened. The arrangement does that work quietly, and the window connects the interior to something beyond itself, a larger, unseen world. An empty room without a window can feel inert. An empty room with a window often feels paused, as though the scene is between moments rather than abandoned altogether. The difference is subtle, but it can be really important to a scene's narrative. Windows can also help miniature artists avoid over-explaining. There's always a temptation, especially late in a build, to justify every corner of a scene, even though we know viewers don't actually process that much information at once. A window offers another option. Instead of adding more information, it allows you to stop. It lets implication carry weight. I think this is one of the reasons windows appear so often in domestic and historical scenes. They allow restraint without emptiness, and restraint at small scale is difficult. At least it's something I always struggle with, not because it's required, but because we often feel compelled to fill space. A window is often the moment where the scene says, "This is enough." That logic becomes even clearer when you look at the formats that have embraced it most fully. Box dioramas, book nooks, facades, and other enclosed worlds. These are scenes you don't walk around, you look into them. They define limits very clearly. They control viewpoint. They simplify decision-making at the bench by saying in advance which angles matter and which ones don't. Windows can become a central component in these formats because they're one of the few ways to introduce complexity without breaking enclosure. They let the world feel larger while the format stays small. They offer depth, narrative, and light control without asking the scene to expand beyond its physical limits. And perhaps more importantly, they protect ambiguity, which tends to hold attention longer than complete disclosure. In an open scene, the viewer can roam freely and impose their own order. In an enclosed space, the artist sets the terms more clearly. A window helps negotiate that balance by giving the viewer the ability to consider the possibilities while keeping the scene organized. But all of this only works when the window is doing real work, because not every scene benefits from one. Sometimes a window weakens a piece instead of strengthening it. A window creates a promise that there is more beyond the wall, and if the scene can't support that promise, visually, narratively, perceptually, the viewer may feel that the scene is flawed or unsuccessful. Sometimes windows fail by explaining too much, too literal a view, too much exterior detail, too much competition with the interior. At miniature scale, realism can sometimes inhibit the imagination of the viewer as opposed to activating it. Other times, windows fail by being too large. Oversized openings can flatten walls, drain enclosure, and make interiors feel exposed rather than contained. Sometimes that can be what you want, but smaller windows often feel more convincing, even when they aren't technically accurate, because they respect how the viewer perceives the world at small scale. And sometimes the right decision is not to open the wall at all. Some scenes need solidity. Some need to feel sealed off from the outside world. Leaving a wall intact can increase focus, deepen atmosphere, and give the space a sense of containment that a window would undo. Knowing when to include a window and when to resist it is part of figuring out how a scene actually works. This is something experience teaches you. It's not about following a motif, it's about listening to what the scene is asking for. Which brings me to where I want to slow down and end this episode. Because windows don't just shape scenes, they shape how we know when to stop. When I think about windows now, not in theory, not as a concept, but in practice, I realize that even when they're present from the beginning, their real function often isn't decided until much later in a build, not while everything is still open and unresolved, but after most of the structural decisions are already in place, and what's left is less about construction and more about judgment. There's a point in miniature work where adding more detail doesn't add clarity. You've probably felt it. The scene is complete in a technical sense, but something still feels uncertain. Not wrong exactly, just unresolved. That's usually when my attention shifts from individual objects to the boundaries that hold the scene together. A window, sometimes in those moments, isn't about creating access to more content. It's about defining limits. Working in winter tends to make this easier to notice, even if the decisions themselves aren't all that different. At that point, my focus usually shifts a little. I'm not trying to add more so much as paying attention to what the scene can already hold. I start asking quieter questions. Not what else needs to go in, but whether what's there is enough. A window is sometimes part of that answer. Sometimes it's something I include, and sometimes it's something I leave out. Either way, once that decision is made, the rest of the build usually becomes easier to finish. And that's often how I know I'm close to being done. What I find interesting is that this isn't about style or symbolism or even narrative in the usual sense. It's about paying attention to how the scene behaves when you stop pushing it forward. Working with windows has made me much more aware of that kind of listening. They're simple elements, but they force you to decide how much of the world the scene can carry and how much it needs to leave outside. I don't think windows are powerful because they let us see out. I think they're powerful because they let us stop looking further. They give us permission to accept the limits of the scene and trust that imagination will carry the rest. Windows offer a different kind of confidence. They say that implication can carry weight, that absence can be active, that not everything needs to be resolved. If you're working on something right now, a box, a vignette, an interior, you might notice yourself standing at that same threshold, wondering whether the scene needs one more object, one more detail, one more opening. It might, or it might already have everything it needs. Learning to recognize that point isn't about rules or personal style. It's about that paying attention to what the scene can already carry and knowing when further explanation would only get in the way. As the days get shorter, I've been thinking more about what it means to choose carefully, deciding what belongs in a scene, what can stay outside the frame, and when a piece feels complete without needing to explain everything. Miniature work has a way of returning you to those questions if you pay attention. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, and trust your own way of seeing. Thanks for listening.